So I ended up leaving medicine to do this because I realized that we have a sacred obligation to now take the earth and protect it and nurture it and lift the burden we have placed. Now, the zero-point energy field has been proven and been published in physics journals and scientific journals. The Casimir effect from, I think, the 1950s. In other words, we had operational anti-gravity devices. And there's a man, a senior scientist, at the largest defense lab in the United States. He's one of 14 crown jewels. I'm quoting from the Secretary of the Navy, who told us this. 14 crown jewels and national treasures in the Department of Defense scientific community. He's on our team. When he retires next year, he wants to work for the OrionProject.org to bring these technologies out because he's built them. The disclosure has happened already because the President and the Congress refused to do it because they were afraid of being either ridiculed, which is the best way to keep things secret, is you marginalize the subject and ridicule it, or they were afraid of actually being snuffed. And this is exactly what the CIA director, Woolsey, said to me. How do we disclose that which we have no access and control over? This would highlight the biggest constitutional crisis in American history, and nobody wants that to happen who are in power. So they take a pass on it. They kick the can down the road and into my lap, and now into your lap. So it's our task now. You see? That's how this is the Washington two-step. And that's how it works. I swear to God. I mean, it's the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the biggest military in the world, so you think they have some juice here, huh? And they say, and he says, well, I want to be read into this project. And they say, sir, we cannot discuss this project with you. You don't have a need to know. And he says, well, God damn it, if I don't have a need to know, who does? And basically, they said, sir, we cannot and will not discuss this with you further. Click. And they broke the line and blocked him. So by the time I came, I gave all this information to him before I did this stand-up briefing at the Pentagon, where I brought astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who was the sixth man to walk on the moon, and all that. And basically what happened is that he said, well, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I don't have access, and I'm being blocked, even though I'm the head of intelligence, Joint Chiefs of Staff. He says, who else has had this happen? I said, well, the President and the Secretary of Defense Cohen and the CIA Director and the Senate Intelligence Committee members I've met with, and the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the biggest intelligence gathering entity in the Pentagon. It's almost as large as the CIA, the DIA. He says, are all of them being blocked access? I said, yes, because the ones that are in those positions right now are people who are in favor of disclosure, and they're not going to tell you. He says, well, who is in this? I said, you have to be willing to take a blood oath to the secrecy and to World War III and interplanetary war. And none of you guys want that, do you? He says, oh, no. I said, that's where we're headed. What are you going to do about it? He says, what can I do? The best thing I have is a B-2 stealth bomber. And these guys have their own Air Force and Space Force of anti-gravity things that people see launching out of here. If you go up to the high desert, you'll see them come out of Edwards at 3 or 4 in the morning. The MO2s at Goldman Sachs and all these places, they do not want this stuff out because there's a $600 trillion nest egg that they're sitting on. Trillion. Now, today, the President released a $3.7 trillion federal budget, $1 trillion of which will be borrowed from China. But as a society, we've been making all the wrong choices since about 1895 or so, where technologies that Tesla tried to bring forward that would have enabled us to have free energy in our homes, which is not a myth, coming out of a generator the size that would fit on this table. And you'd have no pollution, no power bill, no environmental damage. These exist. We've seen them. I'm working with people in classified projects who work on these all the time, the 50th generation of them. Why don't we have them? Because the folks who wanted to keep that stuff secret in 1900, the so-called Gilded Age of the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts, their descendants, not necessarily those families, some of them, and that spiritual mindset of aggregating huge power to a small number of people has gotten more and more. They're the ones who, when someone in their own group steps out of line, like former CIA Director Bill Colby, who was going to provide for my group an operational free energy device and $50 million in seed money to get it out to the world. This was in the mid-90s. They found him floating down the Potomac River the week he was going to meet with a member of my board. This is why so much work went into PLFs, program life forms. And if you look at the videotapes of some of the things like what Stan Romanek, I've been at his home, that one that's in his kitchen that's going like this, that's actually one of the PLFs. And the intelligence community had called him up and said, Stan, this is one of the fake ones. The reason they did is that that was right about the time, that was within about 24 months of when we had finally figured out and built the operating system for how these ET craft move. $200 billion a year going into so-called black projects. And this is what Rumsfeld was talking about. And over the years, it's been trillions of dollars. It's just missing. So one of the problems is that if you have an entity that can make off with hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and then also has become self-funding through the drug trade, all right, this is true. They don't like me talking about this. At Pahut Mesa, there's $40 billion in various currencies in a vault at Nellis Air Force Base from the drug trade. 40 billion sitting there in cash. I have guys who've seen this on my team. So what you find is that there's an enormous amount of funding that goes into these things, and it's very, very dark. And those guys are the hardliners. These are people from deep inside secret government programs or corporate programs working on this. So I'm the sort of the, there's the majestic secret government, parallel government, there's the regular government that we think we elect and appoint and manage, and then there's a third thing, and that's our group. And it's become a formidable force. The guys at the agency are very afraid of us because I've got all this information. Something happens to me, it all hits the internet. Stuff that doesn't need to come out yet. So, because there's a man that we've worked with, Ken Shoulders, who has something called charge cluster arrays, where it actually can take nuclear material, radioactive, low level he's done experiments with, and turn it into inert substances through basically a type of transmutation with very high voltage charge clusters, electromagnetic clusters. The Department of Energy under Bill Richardson was going to fund the next step of that research. The grant was announced, and this secret group, Majestic, circled its limousines around the Department of Energy, threatened Bill Richardson, and they withdrew the grant after it was announced, which is almost unheard of. Which is what I told the head of Army Intelligence in '92 when he offered me $2 billion if I would cooperate with his program. Billion. Witnesses to that, by the way. I said, no thanks. I don't care about money. I don't care about power. I don't care about fame. I care about the truth and transformation of the planet. 1954. I can give you the date, October of '54, when all this stuff went black. They were until then, the aerospace journals in the early 50s were talking about anti-gravity and free energy. You can go back and look it up. It all went black because they finally got this totally operational, and these industrialists came in under the Rockefeller Commission, reorganized the Department of Defense. Everything I'm telling you is a matter of historical fact. You go look it up. And what we have today is a retarded civilization. My uncle built the lunar module that put the first man on the moon. You know, that funny looking thing? That was my uncle's gig at Grumman that became Northrop Grumman. I knew about this stuff as a little kid. That's it. Archibald MacLeish and Buckminster Fuller said this in the 70s. We already back then had the means to recycle everything, so there was no pollution going out of any manufacturing or anything. Early 1900s, with these generators that Tesla and others were doing. You know, J.P. Morgan turned to Tesla and said, look, this is great, you have a car running on free energy and electricity, but if I can't put a meter on it, meaning gasoline or electric meter, then you're not going to come out with it. And high voltage resonant things, they would then pull energy out of the 0-point energy field and do it in a counter-rotating vortex, that thing that would lift, and it could just hover there in the hangar. And these were from the 50s and early 60s. I know guys who piloted them, who are on my team. I have 550 top secret guys now that I'm working with. When Disclosure Project was occurred, so this has been very difficult. And what you find is that the majority doesn't rule even within these classified programs, and it's all very compartmented. And the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing half the time. For example, it wasn't until we came forward with the information about PLFs and ARVs. Everybody know what those are? Programmed life forms and alien reproduction vehicles. Now, since 1950s, we've been building these things that look like UFOs that fly around. And Lockheed Martin, and there's a facility up here near Palmdale and Lancaster that have them. I know where all the facilities are. The state-of-the-art ones are in Australia and in Dugway, near Salt Lake City, Provo, Utah. In 1956, if you want a short history of the United States, now we're going to have a lot to cover, but I want to get this out of the way. The Rockefeller Commission reorganized the Department of Defense and the CIA into a Byzantine and labyrinthine entity that prevented the Congress and the oversight committees and the President of the United States have operational control over super projects. As Senator Inouye said in the Iran-Contra hearings, he says there exists a secret government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own funding mechanism that's above the law and free from the law itself. Before him, Eisenhower said, beware the military-industrial complex because it will become a threat to our democracy and our way of life. Now, this is from a five-star general. And why don't you do it? And I laughed. And this is exactly what Lawrence Rockefeller said to me. I was standing out on his deck in the Grand Tetons. You know, they own the Tetons. Of course, Rockefellers owned everything. And they gave it to the, if you've ever been to Grand Teton National Park, that was all owned by the Rockefeller family, but they kept out this absolutely amazing ranch where I've been there. And Lawrence turned to me and said, well, I can't do it because my family's already jumping up and down on my, should I say what he actually said, on my nuts. And it's hard to be honest because people like to sugarcoat everything. And I said, well, Lawrence, you know, we need your help, because he really was wanting to defect from his brother at Chase Manhattan Bank, David, and bring this stuff out. He says, oh no, I can't. My family is really upset with me that I'm even hosting you and the Clintons and all this stuff. And I said, well, Lawrence, you're old and you're rich and you're a Rockefeller. He said, doesn't matter. Blood's thicker than water, and I can't do it, but you can. So then I went to the head of the National Academy, the Deputy Director of National Academy of Sciences, who said the same thing to me, and to the members of the Intelligence Committee of the Senate, the Select Committee on Intelligence. And what I found was that there was this enormous cowardice in our society where people really want to have, and I found out eventually someone just pulled me aside and they said, look, you're expendable because you're not important, and this is risky, and no one wants to take this risk. The President of the United States before W was a man named Bill Clinton, and after we provided the briefings for him and his CIA director, he sent his good friend to my home and said, look, if the president does what you're recommending, he will end up like Jack Kennedy. And I thought he was joking, and he wasn't. And I said to this man, I said, well, what do you want me to do? I'm just a country doctor at the time in North Carolina, rattling around in an ER, taking care of shootings and stabbings and car wrecks and heart attacks and strokes and all that fun stuff. And he said, well, we think you can do it. I said, oh, yeah? I said, what are you saying to me? And he said, the president and the CIA director and the people who are part of this secret group that we've found out think that you can do it. The 1/3 of Majestic, this is called Majestic 12 group, Magi, Cosmic Ops. And I, worked for years as an emergency doctor and supporting 4 children, and now I have two grandchildren and one on the way, and the third one. And I think, oh my God, here we are in 2011, still using oil and gas. Our technological capabilities have outstripped our social and spiritual development to such a point that we now can not only destroy all life on Earth, we can destroy other worlds completely.
And there is this sort of strange hypocrisy with the mainstream media, and that is, if you had 3 people who would go on record with the New York Times or Washington Post about a senior person at the White House having sex with someone, it'd be all over. I have 110 people on videotape and testimony with corroborating documents, with their DD-214s, which is their discharge papers from the military, with signed statements, witness oaths that they would testify under oath before Congress with the penalties of perjury, federal penalties of perjury, and it gets ignored by all the mainstream media. You talk about a double standard.